Welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast, where trauma survivors become healthy thrivers. Each month, we'll feature a theme in the trauma recovery and empowerment field. To promote your recovery, healing, and learning how to build dreams, here's your host, Karen Robinson, transformational coach and therapist.
Hi, and welcome to the Heal, Thrive, Dream podcast. Our guest is Michelle Brown. She's a functional nutrition and lifestyle practitioner and clinical herbalist with bachelor's degree in botany. She also holds a certificate as a mastery level biology of trauma advanced provider. She works with clients from around the world to address anxiety, depression, fatigue, and other chronic health issues from a root cause, trauma-informed perspective. This approach addresses nervous system dysregulation and emphasizes the mind-body connection that allows true healing to happen. So what a unique bio. I don't think I've had one like that before. I've had functional medicine doctors, I've had nutritionists, but your blend of things. I'm most curious, Michelle, about the mastery level biology of trauma. Can you tell us a little more about that? And hi, by the way.
Hello, thank you for having me, Karen. It's nice to be here. And yes, I've blended my functional nutrition background with my practice as a clinical herbalist, and then brought in this biology of trauma professional piece into the picture as well, and found that, this intersection of functional nutrition with understanding trauma and this root cause approach that blends all of that together has been so powerful in helping clients to really move past, some of these chronic health issues that end up, causing people to get stuck in patterns of anxiety or depression or fatigue. And so that biology of trauma piece is really looking at how trauma impacts our nervous system biology, right? At the cellular level, even, there are things that change, the shifts that happen on the hormonal level. Our immune system are impacted by our response to trauma. And so when I started understanding how the nervous system is really the underlying piece for all of these chronic health issues, that's where I really started to notice that I was helping people actually move forward. They were able to get past some of these chronic patterns that were showing up. So that nervous system biology piece is where I really like to focus when I'm starting with clients.
Beautiful. A lot of times when I have guests on this show, they're either trauma survivors or healers. A lot of the times they're both. Are you also a personal trauma survivor?
Well, that's an interesting question because, if you had asked me before I started working with trauma biology, I would have said no. I felt like I lived a fairly normal life and had experienced, a regular childhood. And I didn't really identify as someone who had trauma. And yet, as I learned what trauma was, right, I began to understand that trauma is not about something that we've gone through. It's really not about the event, but it's about our experience in our body going through a situation. And that means that, for one thing, trauma looks very different for one person versus another. And it also means that trauma is often not what we think it is. So did I experience trauma? Yes. I can share more about some situations that I went through as a teenager. I ended up with an eating disorder through most of high school and struggled with that into my late teens, early 20s. And all of that came about from some trauma that was actually happening in my home life. And yet I had no recognition that that's really what was happening, that this was actually a trauma response, right? That I was going through, that was leading me to reach for food as a coping mechanism, basically, to try to deal with this overwhelm that I was feeling in my body and in my nervous system, that I really didn't have any other healthy coping mechanisms to help me address that or to deal with it. And so, that was my experience of trauma. So did I go through, kind of what we call the big T, capital T trauma. No, but I did go through these stressful, overwhelming experiences in life that definitely impacted my nervous system, my ability to show up in life fully. And, I have an autoimmune condition, Hashimoto's. And we know that from the work of Dr. Vincent Felitti, for example, right? He's the author of the Adverse Childhood Events Study. And you've probably seen, of course, the ACEs study, and there's a quiz, right, you can take to assess your level of adverse childhood events and how they may be impacting you. But we know that someone who's gone through certain adverse events in their childhood are more susceptible to things like autoimmune diseases and other chronic health issues. So that was part of my story with trauma. But, I think a lot of people are walking around not really understanding what trauma even is and how it's impacting them. And so whether you kind of had that big T trauma, or maybe you are like me and you really would have said, I had a pretty normal childhood. My life was pretty good. I didn't go through trauma. And yet here we are with these chronic patterns showing up in our body that are telling us something's out of balance. And again, that nervous system piece is really where things are being dysregulated, right? On that really fundamental level of our biology.
So it's safe to say that your history had a direct impact on your career trajectory. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I mean, I was always interested in nutrition from, a younger age, but then, having walked through my own experience with trauma and eating disorders and chronic health issues, I think definitely impacted my ability to work with others and to really see how I could shift my own health and my own biology, and then be able to help other people who we're seeing, right? We're just stuck in these chronic patterns as well and not able to understand. Again, it's really this intersection of our nervous system, trauma patterns, and our biology that show up as these chronic patterns in our life. So definitely a part of my passion is what I went through myself, and I love helping others to kind of connect those dots, because I didn't for a very long time. And it was sort of like a slow process of learning about functional medicine and the root cause approach to some of the chronic health issues that I was experiencing that I really wasn't getting answers to from conventional medicine, and then understanding this nervous system trauma piece that was like another layer of like, oh, this is why these patterns are showing up in my life. And I think this is so true for so many people, that they're walking around feeling really dysregulated, dealing with chronic health patterns, and looking for answers, really wanting to find out what's going on, and yet they're not getting those answers from that conventional medical approach. And so I think we need to talk more about trauma in our society and how it shows up and why it shows up, because people are walking around very dysregulated and not recognizing the trauma pattern, right?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the connection between trauma and autoimmune disease and just medical issues in general. A lot of people out there, though, still don't see the connection or know about the connection between trauma and eating disorders. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Sure, I would love to, because again, that was a big part of my story. And so when I was a teenager, I felt like I grew up in a pretty normal home. I mean, nobody's family is perfect, and mine certainly wasn't. But, I had two parents that loved me, took care of me. We did pretty well. And yet, when I was a sophomore in high school, my aunt, my mom's only sister, she was diagnosed with cancer. And over kind of from the beginning of my sophomore year until about the end or so that spring, she, got sicker and sicker, and she passed away. And this was a really stressful time in my family, as you can imagine. And, again, my mom's only sister, so really difficult time for her and her family and her parents. And she didn't know how to deal with this. And it actually kind of brought up, I think, some past trauma from their childhood. And So I feel like this was a period of time where my two parents really kind of checked out. I mean, like they still went to work, put food on the table, but like, they weren't really there for each other emotionally or for us as kids and, myself and my brother and sister. And I didn't know how to deal with all of this as a 15-year-old. It was really overwhelming. So the only thing I really knew to do to have any control at that time was to control what I was eating. And it kind of started out like a diet. And of course, this was the 90s. So, like thin was in and everything was low fat, right? And so I really started cutting out food and cutting fat out of my diet and losing weight and just becoming really obsessed with that number on the scale, even though I didn't need to lose weight. And looking back now, I recognize so clearly that it was just this sense of needing some type of control in my life that I didn't have at that time. It actually spun out of control to where I started binge eating and even purging for a short time. And then, I felt so out of control at that point. And yeah, this was my coping mechanism. When my nervous system felt really dysregulated, I felt some sense of safety, right? Some sense of control when I could control what I was eating or, when I would overeat, right? There would be at least this ability to stop feeling the pain, right, in my body. And when we feel trauma, we're feeling something in our body. And so eventually I was able to kind of overcome this eating disorder and move forward. And, I got married, I had kids, and yet many years later, almost 20 years later, Karen, I found myself in a new place. I was going through a divorce and moving to a new city with my three kids. And I mean, I was a health coach by this time. It's what I did full time and helping other people with their health. And yet I found myself in my kitchen at night after I would put my kids to bed, getting out a jar of peanut butter and a bag of chocolate chips and just eating and thinking like, what am I doing? I felt like I couldn't stop. But it was right around this time I started learning about my nervous system and really not even from a trauma-informed approach yet, but just understanding what I was feeling in my body. And I actually was doing this little like mindset coaching program. And this coach invited us to start noticing what we were feeling in our body when, whatever was showing up for us. Everybody, of course, had their own different issues that were showing up in different ways. And, she asked us to start noticing what we were feeling. So, if you think about when you're really, truly hungry, if you're in tune with that, I'm putting my hand on my belly here and noticing like, there's this like rumbling in your belly, right? This hunger that tells you, oh, I need to get up and go find something to eat. And yet, if I think of a different sensation of like anxiety, for example, I feel that, I put my hands here on my chest and push in because that's the sensation of anxiety for me and similar for many people, although it may show up in a different way for other people. But I just feel this sense of like someone pushing, right? Standing there pushing against me. And it's very uncomfortable, even just now to kind of push in there. I feel that kind of sense of like, stop. And, we might feel another sensation like anger, for example, right? Maybe a tightening in the back of the neck or the shoulders. And, when we say I'm anxious, or I'm angry, or I'm happy, we feel something in our body. I mean, we should be able to notice the place in our body where we feel that. So the next time I went into the kitchen and had that urge to reach for the jar of peanut butter or the bag of chocolate chips, I just stopped for a moment and I just noticed, what am I feeling in my body? And Karen, like I was floored to recognize that I was not hungry at all, of course. I was feeling this overwhelming sense of anxiety, right? Fear. It was just like pressing in on my chest. And at that time, the only coping mechanism I had, the only tool I had to relieve that was to reach for food. So it's so common. And, we beat ourselves up over these things. We feel really ashamed. I know I did. I felt really guilty. Like, why am I doing this? I feel like I can't stop. It's out of control. And yet it was the only thing that I knew to do at that time to relieve this overwhelming sense of anxiety that I was feeling. And I'm grateful now that I've gone on to understand how to, number one, feel what I'm feeling in my body, but then to have other tools that I can use to regulate my nervous system response. But I'm just using that example to show you that, we have these coping mechanisms that can show up in life when we feel overwhelmed, when we are stuck in this nervous system response that we can call the trauma response, because we can relive this response of our nervous system over and over if we don't know how to connect with our body and move through a trauma response or a stress response, which are two different things, in a safe way. So, again, when we have a coping mechanism, whether we're struggling with food or eating disorders or maybe drinking wine or alcohol or other substances, however things show up, as frustrating as they are, as, guilty as we may feel, we need to recognize that these things are coping mechanisms that are actually helping us to get through a really stressful, overwhelming sense in our body that we don't know otherwise how to shift, right?
Excellent. I really love this discussion because food and controlling eating and whatever patterns has definitely been a theme for how I've coped with my own trauma. So it definitely relates. I think it will resonate with people listening. Can you share a little bit about what healthy coping skills you use now instead of turning to food when you feel dysregulated?
Sure. Well, absolutely. I'm just thinking of how, number one, I'm thinking of that nervous system biology piece as the foundation, because when our nervous system biology, we can talk a little bit more about what that means exactly, but when we're dysregulated, often it's so much easier to feel overwhelmed, to feel that dysregulation, and then we need those coping mechanisms, right, in order to feel that sense of safety and support in our body. So I like to start by thinking about that nervous system biology piece. How can we regulate that so we don't go into overwhelm so quickly and easily? But we can also use some simple tools in order to shift the state of our nervous system. And this is kind of the idea behind somatic work or somatic experiencing, which is a really lovely foundation for trauma work because, like I was explaining with that ability to feel anxiety in my chest, when I say I was really amazed to recognize that anxiety was actually what I was feeling when I thought I was hungry, because I was so disconnected from what I was really feeling. I didn't even recognize that I'm actually feeling this pressure in my chest, this anxiety. We dissociate from the body when we feel overwhelmed because it's uncomfortable, right? We don't like the sensation of anxiety or depression, fear, however it's showing up in our body, the tightness in our shoulders, or maybe we kind of hold tension in our belly, for instance. So many people, they dissociate from the body. They kind of stop feeling their body. So the idea there is we need to start reconnecting with what we're truly feeling and experiencing in the body. And just simple somatic tools can be really valuable here, really especially focusing on creating a sense of safety, right, in the body, of support. And these can be really simple. And if it's okay, I'll share a nice one to start with. And if anyone's listening, they can try this out with me if they feel inclined to do so. But as I'm just sitting here in this room that I'm in, and I'm going to just like look around a little bit, right? I'm looking to my right, I'm looking to my left, I'm looking above me. I'm orienting myself to the space that I'm in. And it's a really simple thing, but so often we kind of are in our heads and we're not really, again, connecting to our body and what we're actually feeling. And, the job of the nervous system is to help us feel safe, right? We're kind of always in the background. It's like this computer program that's kind of scanning the background for viruses, right? We probably all have it on our computers. And that is basically what our nervous system is doing. It's trying to make sure we're safe. And so by just looking around, orienting to my environment, looking behind me, right? I see there's no tiger behind me, right? Nothing's about to jump out and get me. No monsters under the desk. I'm safe, right? I'm connected to my body and I'm recognizing that sense of safety. That's just one really simple place to start. And I love to stop and do this sometimes when I'm working, on my computer or maybe after a call, because again, we get really kind of focused in our heads and we kind of forget, right, that we have a body sometimes. And it's this ability to kind of connect then again with ourselves, with our body, with what we're actually experiencing and feeling. And maybe as I do that and I start recognizing what I'm noticing in my body, if I'm feeling like, oh, my back's a little uncomfortable, maybe I need to move around. Maybe I need to find some support there, right? We're often holding these tension patterns that we don't even recognize, right? So a little, if I sit here all day and I'm working at my computer and my back is kind of hurting, I'm holding tension there, that's a lot of energy that I'm putting into, I may not even be noticing, but a lot of energy is going into holding that tension in my body. If you think of like holding a fist, right? If I take my fist and I clench it and I hold it really tightly, and I just do that the whole time that we're sitting here talking, by the time we're done, like my hand is going to be tired, right? It's probably going to be sore a little bit. And yet we hold these tension patterns in our body in response to stress and trauma often, and we don't recognize it. But there's where some of that fatigue shows up around the trauma response. We often refer to it as the freeze response as well, right? And this tightness, this tension, this lack of fluidity, right? Things can't, like blood, for instance, oxygen can't flow when there's tension to a muscle. So just beginning with like working with simple mind body practices, I like to call them somatic exercises, scanning the body. If I notice tension, maybe I can work with releasing that if it feels safe. That's a really lovely place to start. But again, I like to go back again to the nervous system biology, because we often have patterns that are showing up there that are making us more susceptible, if you will, to overwhelm and stress. And so when we shift that biology, it's like our capacity of our nervous system to then shift, to handle stress, to deal with the things come up in our life. It's just expanded. And so that's why I focus a lot with that nervous system biology with the clients that I work with.
Can you run us through what a typical session is like with you and one of your clients? I know like everybody has a different health and mental health and hormonal energy stuff going on, but maybe a case study that you really felt your work made a difference for.
Yeah, that sounds great. You're right. Everybody shows up a little bit differently. And so that ability to recognize that and kind of meet clients where they're at, I think is one of the really lovely things about a functional approach. There's a lot of programs out there that are, a detox program or a keto program. They're kind of one size fits all. And yet a functional nutrition approach is really looking at the person in front of me and understanding what are their particular root causes, does their nervous system need right now? What is their biology showing up as that needs to be shifted and addressed? And so when I'm working with someone, I first start out with some assessments that I give clients, because these tell me a lot about what's going on with the person in front of me. I have some assessments that look at neurotransmitters. I have some assessments that look at biochemical imbalances that are often playing a role for someone who is dealing with kind of chronic anxiety and depression type of pattern. And so I think it's really fascinating as well how there's a certain like constellation of symptoms or patterns that show up with these different imbalances. So for example, when I give someone a neurotransmitter assessment, I know someone who has low dopamine, which is one of our neurotransmitters. I like to think of neurotransmitters as like our feel-good chemicals in the brain. And so for dopamine, as an example, it's this neurotransmitter that helps us stay focused and present and get things done. And if we're low in dopamine, we're struggling with those things, right? We're dealing with lack of focus. We're probably like starting things but not able to finish them. These are the people who often need like some coffee or caffeine to kind of help them get back into focus. And yet that's very different than someone who has a pattern of low serotonin, for example. And so I can give someone an assessment, and just like the eating disorder patterns, that's often a picture of someone with low serotonin or just craving sugar or carbs, especially late afternoon or evening, maybe not sleeping well. These are people who tend to feel a little more down, depressed. They may have seasonal depression. And so as I give someone an assessment and they start like checking off all those boxes, the more I become, suspecting that they are low in these specific neurotransmitters. And then there are specific nutrients, herbs, in some cases, amino acids that we can use to help actually repair the gap there that's happening with those neurotransmitters. And just like that, for someone with low serotonin, I'm thinking of a client I worked with who was, probably mid 30s. She had a few kids who were like grade school age, and she was going back to school. So life was busy for her. And she was really struggling with her eating and reaching for food late afternoon, and, sugar, of course, those carbs that tend to be the foods we like to reach for. And of course, it was affecting her weight. And again, there's that like shame and guilt and why can't I shift this pattern? All the things that come up with that. And as we just worked on some neurotransmitter support for her, she really saw that shift. And then, we did a little bit more work to address biochemical imbalances and, of course, worked on nutrition. But she was really able to shift that pattern of reaching for food in the afternoon just by addressing the neurotransmitter support. And then she started just having more energy, that capacity that I like to talk about to make the changes we need to make. So she started eating better. Some of that weight started coming off for her that she was wanting to see shift. And so again, I'm always looking at someone as an individual sitting in front of me and what's out of balance for them. And it can be completely different from the next person I'm working with. But as I start with some of the assessments, that's where I start to see, kind of how these patterns are showing up for clients and where we can bring the most attention in order to shift those patterns.
No, that's really wonderful. I think you'd probably be a really good teacher, professor too. You have a nice way of explaining terms. That's really lovely.
Thank you.
I know you're a published author. Do you want to share some about your books or your favorite books or whatever resonates? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I have a book called Energy Reset that really looks at helping women to understand, again, kind of this root cause approach to shifting low energy and other chronic patterns. And a lot of that tells my story. I go a little more in depth with my struggle with not only my eating disorder struggle, but my struggle with Hashimoto, which is an autoimmune thyroid condition, and how, I just couldn't get the answers that I needed until I came into this functional approach. And yet a lot of women are just not aware that there's even something they can do to shift these patterns with their diet, with nutrition, with working on the nervous system response. And so that's really what Energy Reset goes into. How can we take this root cause approach where we're looking at the underlying patterns, like what's causing these low energy patterns, these autoimmune patterns. And often there's things going on like inflammation, nutrient deficiencies. Sometimes there's chronic infections. Like I had an H. pylori infection, for instance, that I discovered was part of what was keeping me stuck in that kind of chronic low pattern or low energy pattern. So that's the goal with Energy Reset, how to kind of understand this root cause approach. And, it's been really a joy to kind of share that book with women and share my own story in that book, because so many of my readers have come back and, said like, oh, this is what I didn't know. I didn't have this perspective on why I've been feeling, tired, run down, dealing with these chronic health issues. And so I'm also working on another book actually on kind of more from my herbal tradition and that perspective, and using herbs to help support healing of the nervous system from trauma, which again affects everything, doesn't it? Right? Our energy, our mood, and these other health conditions that can show up as a result of a nervous system that's stuck in a trauma pattern. And so, yeah, this is definitely an area I feel really passionate about helping others with, because I've been there myself on that journey.
Yes, your books look amazing. I can't wait to check those out more.
Thank you.
And so I know for our listeners today, you're offering a gift of it, and we'll have that link in the show notes. But can you share where listeners should go if they would like to connect with you or learn more about you?
Absolutely. You can find me online. My website is botanacea.com, and that's botanacea.com, but I'm sure you can put that in the show notes as well for your listeners, and definitely connect with me there. You can find my email address on that website as well. And then if you grab the assessment, this is one of the assessments I was talking about actually that I give clients, where it's looking at show up around low neurotransmitter function. And this is so valuable because sometimes when we're stuck in these patterns with low neurotransmitters, low serotonin, that assessment also looks at GABA as well as endorphins, then we often feel overwhelmed, depressed, anxious. We can't get focused. And again, that's going to impact everything in our life, right? And so by working on supporting neurotransmitters, that's where I can give people a quick win, right? Just get them to a place where they're feeling better, they have a little more energy, that capacity to do the things they need and want to do to move forward in life. And just like that client I mentioned who, we supported her low serotonin symptoms, and she was able to really shift some long-standing patterns of reaching for food as a pick-me-up, right? For not just energy, but for her mood. And so I think everyone will really get a lot out of that assessment, and use some tips in there as well about what to do once you recognize which of your potential neurotransmitter systems might be out of balance.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Michelle, for being a guest on here today. It was really, really educational and helpful.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Karen.
Thank you for listening in today. Please join us next week, same day and time. Also, I would love for you to check out my website, healthrivedream.com.